Hello and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. As we record this episode on January 19th, 2021, the nation's capital, indeed the whole nation, is still reeling from the events of January 6th, when a Stop the Steal rally in Washington, D.C. erupted into violence as some supporters of President Trump, apparently motivated by his repeated baseless charges that the presidential election was stolen, stormed the Capitol building during a joint session of Congress that had convened to certify the electoral results. Some involved seemed swept up in events. Others, though, had come prepared, armed with firearms and other weapons, and equipped with zip ties in the apparent intent to kidnap the elected officials. Among the organized participants in the violence, some have been identified as belonging to or being associated with the right-wing anti-government extremist group, the Oath Keepers. The Washington Post reports today that at least two Oath Keeper leaders, also associated with another anti-government extremist group, the so-called Ohio State Regular Militia, have been charged with conspiracy to commit offenses against the United States based on actions stemming from the January 6th events. Understanding the strength, relationship, and risk posed by the variety of right-wing extremist groups has assumed greater urgency as threats to the inauguration of President-elect Biden continue, and threats have been levied against all 50 state capitals and online discussion groups. Among the most disturbing and urgent questions associated with this is the involvement of current or former police and military, a characteristic of the Oath Keepers. To help us understand this, we're joined by Dr. Sam Jackson, who's an assistant professor in the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity at the University of Albany. Dr. Jackson has several lines of research. He primarily studies far-right extremism in America, particularly anti-government extremism. His second line of research investigates issues related to extremism online and responses to it. And in a third area, he examines behaviors on social media platforms, particularly political activism, or activity in the context of conflicts and crises. He also develops methods and open source tools to analyze internet-based data. Most relevant to our discussion today, he is the author of Oath Keepers: Patriotism and the Edge of Violence in a Right-Wing Anti-Government Group, published by Columbia University Press in September 2020. Sam, thanks very much. Welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Perhaps we could begin just with a little bit of context because, unfortunately, we're at a point where you can't tell the players without a program. Who or what are the Oath Keepers? Why were they founded and when?
The Oath Keepers is, as the subtitle of my book suggests, a far-right anti-government group in the U.S. It's a group that was founded in 2009 based on a perception that the federal government was engaged in or was preparing for tyranny, and that tyrannical threat posed by the federal government was the greatest threat facing American life and liberty in the country. So the organization was founded to encourage those that the group would refer to as patriots to be ready to fight back against government whenever necessary. So the group was founded by a guy named Stuart Rhodes. Rhodes is a graduate of Yale Law School and a former Army paratrooper. And he and some of his friends who were involved in law enforcement decided that they specifically wanted to encourage current and former law enforcement and military to honor their oaths to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And over the course of the group's history, they've really been much more focused on the domestic threats rather than the foreign threats.
I'm just curious if there's any significance to when the group was founded. I mean, there has been a strain of anti-government extremism in the United States for many years. A distrust of government is inherent in many ways, as the Oath Keepers would argue, to our founding as well as to our political tradition. But what made the conditions particularly ripe at this time?
Oath Keepers are part of what I call the Patriot Militia movement. And this movement emerged in the 1990s in the aftermath of some deadly interactions between Americans and law enforcement in Ruby Ridge, in Idaho, and the Waco siege in Texas in the early 1990s. The movement drastically grew around the time of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, as people increasingly paid attention to this form of anti-government extremism in the U.S. But by 2000 or 2001, the movement had really fallen from its high point in the middle of the decade for a number of reasons that other smart people like Mark Pickavage have pointed out time and again. Throughout the early 2000s, America as a whole was much more focused on foreign threats. particularly the threat posed by foreign jihadi terrorism. Thinking of the aftermath of September 11th, the attacks on that day, it was very much a rally around the flag kind of moment where the country came together. And I think by the time we get to 2008 or so, some of that extreme unity that emerges after an attack like 9/11 had started to dissipate a little bit. And we increasingly saw people willing to criticize the American government, much larger numbers of people than in the past. And if we think about the 2008 presidential election, we saw the candidacy of the first African American nominated to the presidency who would later win, Barack Obama. And we also saw the rise of movements like the Tea Party, who were worried about the federal government doing too much, becoming too involved in economic matters and in other sorts of ways that supporters of the Tea Party would say violated their rights. So Oath Keepers really emerged in this moment where more Americans were beginning to talk about the federal government violating their rights.
So, one of the challenges in any discussion of political violence, but it's especially salient in a discussion of political violence inside the United States, is that the terms and the definitions can become blurred. And I thought one tremendous strength among many in your book was that you began with some very straightforward definitions and typologies of what constitutes extremism, what constitutes conservative, what constitutes right wing versus left wing. I was wondering if you could share those with us and talk about them just a little bit, because I thought they did a great deal to add clarity to the discussion.
When I started working on the far right, I used the concept of political extremism to sort of center my thoughts and to help me figure out what I was interested in, what I was not interested in. And at that point, 2013, 2014, I wasn't really satisfied with existing definitions of extremism. So I decided I needed to write my own. And that eventually came out in a piece that I published in Terrorism and Political Violence, which also contributed to one of the chapters of the book, where I argue that political extremism is an attempt to change some core fundamental features of a political system, to fundamentally change that political system. So for me, that includes things like Oath Keepers who want to change the rejection of nonviolence and non-intimidation that's at the heart of American politics. And it would also include things like terrorism. If we think of something like religious terrorism that wants to enforce a particular religious perspective or something like that. So then right-wing terrorism, I tend to think that the core feature of right-wing anything is a sense that there was some ideal political community in the past, and that in order to fix the country, which is somehow broken or things have gone wrong, we need to restore that past. Now, I think it's really important to point out that past doesn't necessarily have to ever have existed. What's important is that the people who are right-wing think that it existed.
I was just going to say, you've got a terrific phrase in the book where you mentioned that they work for an imagined, though not necessarily imaginary, past in the case of right wing, and an imagined, though not necessarily imaginary, future in the case of left wing. And I just thought that captured it really, really concisely and really well.
That's a not so subtle nod to Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, this foundational work about nationalism.
So we talked just a little bit before we started recording, and I think it's worth discussing why, especially at a time when so much of the focus has been on foreign issues as well as foreign terrorist threats, would you choose to focus on a right-wing anti-government group as the object of your research?
Oh, backstory time. I suppose I'll give a shout out to one of my professors as an undergrad. I did my undergrad work at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and I was a religious studies major. And I accidentally took a religion and violence class taught by Professor Rosalind Hackett. And this was in 2007, 2008, somewhere around there. So as you can imagine, a lot of what we read was about Al-Qaeda and other groups like that. We read some stuff about anti-abortion violence in the US and other types of terrorism related to religion as well. But one thing that I really noticed was that there seemed to be an absence of research about current extremism in America that is based in some sort of American identity. And that just seemed like a huge gap to me, and I wanted to understand it. And eventually, I realized that there's this idea of patriotism or national identity that really motivates some pretty uh, divisive rhetoric and ideas, and can motivate conflict and violence. And there just wasn't enough known about this type of extremism.
We also discussed briefly, you made an interesting methodological choice in how you went about it because you decided to assess this group not through participant observation, nor through interviews, nor through law enforcement sources, but in their own words. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what led you to that method and what risks and challenges you found associated with it.
Part of that decision was very practical. I actually reached out to Stuart Rhodes, the president of Oath Keepers, early in the planning stages of the project to see if I wanted to do interviews with members of national leadership for the organization. And I reached out to him to see if he would be interested in doing an interview with me and helping me do interviews with others. And he made it very clear that he was not interested in helping me whatsoever. So then I had this decision to make. Do I try to do a more participant observation study of everyday participation in the movement, or do I want to keep my focus on leadership and on the ideas? And I'm just really fascinated by ideas and rhetoric and symbols. So I decided to stick with the focus on leadership. And ultimately, I ended up using data entirely from the internet, and even more narrowly, only things that the group has decided to share, which leaves me in this slightly odd position occasionally where I'm treating things as data that the group hasn't necessarily produced themselves, but they've chosen to share it. And I argue that this helps me understand the public image that the group wants to put out. How does the group itself want to be understood by those that it's reaching and those that it wants to convince?
So that's a good segue because in the book you identify three significant themes that they develop. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us about these themes and your assessment of how and why they use and develop them in trying to advance their views.
Sure. So the book has three core empirical chapters, and each one tackles a different one of those themes. The three themes are language from the founders, like the language of natural rights. The second theme is the Revolutionary War as a moment of conflict and crisis that the group uses to interpret contemporary America. And the third theme is more recent events that the group uses, like the Revolutionary War, to interpret contemporary America. And I focus on Waco and on Hurricane Katrina. The first theme there is natural rights. My interest here is in this is kind of an arcane term. It's not something that we throw around a lot, or at least not something that I throw around a lot in everyday life. It has its moments where it's more common, which seems to be in right-leaning political activism spheres. But I was really curious in understanding how the group uses that rhetoric and why they use that rhetoric. And what I argue in the book is that they strategically deploy this term that was used by the founders in order to subtly suggest, hey, we're like these folks in the 18th century who fought against the British. We care about the same things that they care about. Therefore, we have some of the same legitimacy, or should have some of the same legitimacy that these actors have. They also engage in something that I call strategic ambiguity, where they talk about natural rights and they say things like, you need to be ready to take up your arms in defense of your natural rights. But they never actually define what natural rights are or tell you how to identify what your natural rights are. And in fact, they really open the door for people to make decisions on their own about their natural rights and when they're threatened by saying things like, don't turn to the Constitution for a list of your natural rights. That's a partial enumeration of your list. Your rights are God given, they are natural, and they go far beyond what is mentioned in the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights. So I argue that this rhetoric around natural rights really is meant to set the stage and to begin the process of saying the Oath Keepers are like those who fought against the British in the Revolutionary War.
And that's a theme that you developed then in the second empirical chapter. And tell us a little more about some of the symbology they've chosen to use there and how they use that.
Yeah, this chapter is really interesting to me. I guess the whole book's interesting to me, but this chapter in particular, because of how explicitly they do this, time and again throughout the group's history, they make an effort, a strong effort, to portray themselves as being like the founders. They do this in a range of different ways. For example, the group's first public event on April 21st, 2009, and it happened outside of Boston, Massachusetts, on the Lexington Green. So this event took place on the space on the anniversary of the first battle of the Revolutionary War. And in a speech that day, Stuart Rhodes says that he chose that date and location intentionally in order to, he says something like, to remind us all of where we have come from. And the idea is very much, we are like these founders. We are like these patriots who fought against the British, and we're going to emulate them in numerous ways. You can see this in the patches used by the group. So we've seen some images of this in the past couple of days, which is this famous image of Captain John Parker. And this statue sits on the Lexington Green, and it points to one of the commanding officers in that battle. And they have incorporated it into their logo that appears all over the place, as yet another reminder that we are like the founders. They have this core document for them, which is their declaration of 10 orders we will not obey. And they start off that document with a long quote from General George Washington from a speech that he gave to his troops before the Battle of Long Island. It's a pretty famous quote. Unfortunately, I'm bad at memorizing things, so I can't quote the whole thing.
George Washington knew it by heart.
I'm sure he did. It says something to the effect of, the time is now near at hand, which must soon determine whether we all are to be free men or slaves, with some other language thrown in there as well. And immediately after providing the quote, Oath Keepers in this document says, such a time is now near at hand again. And then they walk through these 10 orders that they will not obey, things like any order to confiscate guns, or any order to barricade a city, or any order to declare martial law. And out of these 10 orders, 7 of them, they have these little descriptive paragraphs after they provide the order they will not obey, where they describe how that order might come about or why they wouldn't obey that order. And in 7 of those 10 orders, the short descriptions after the orders explicitly talk about the run up to the Revolutionary War.
But they see echoes of this in contemporary events. And in your third empirical chapter, you cover 2 in particular. And I'm curious both about the echoes that they pull from it, but also their selectivity in which events they choose to highlight and which they don't.
Sure. So that third empirical chapter focuses on 2 events. The first one is Waco. So in the development of that first wave of the Patriot Militia movement, there were 2 signal moments early on that motivated the rise of this form of extremism. The first was the Ruby Ridge shooting, where alleged white extremist in northern Idaho, he was sort of tricked into selling illegally modified shotguns to an ATF informant, and the ATF tried to use that as leverage to get him to be an informant on the local Aryan Nations compound, a well-known white supremacist organization. That man named Randy Weaver, he refused, and along with his family, they holed up in their remote cabin in Idaho. Eventually, the ATF decided to be a little bit more proactive in bringing him in, and they ended up accidentally getting in a shoot-off with Randy's friend and his young son named Sammy. Sammy was killed along with one of the ATF agents, and that led to a long standoff. Eventually, Vicki Weaver, Randy Weaver's wife, was also killed. And during the time of the standoff, this became a rallying point and a rallying cry for far-right extremists, especially but not only white supremacists. And in the aftermath of that event, it became this moment of, the government is willing to use force against Americans. Shortly after that, we had the Waco siege. This was in Waco, Texas, at the Branch Davidian compound. The ATF once again got reports that the Branch Davidians were illegally manufacturing automatic weapons and possibly were involved in drug manufacturing and child abuse as well. They went and they tried to execute a search warrant for a number of reasons. They did so in a relatively aggressive way that led to an exchange of gunfire between the Branch Davidians and the ATF. That then led to a long standoff. The FBI got involved, and in the end, more than 70 Branch Davidians died rather than surrendering to law enforcement. These two moments in particular, anti-government extremists will point to as saying the federal government is ready and willing to use violence through the mechanism of law enforcement to violate your rights.
You also talked briefly about another event that many of our listeners will remember, which was the standoff at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in Oregon. And curiously, you mentioned that this was not an event that Oath Keepers have chosen to highlight their participation in, nor make an essential part of their iconography, if you will. Why not?
Yeah, in fact, they did not support the occupation, at least formally from an organizational perspective. So just a couple of words of background about the occupation for those who might need their memory to be jogged. A couple of years after the notorious standoff at Cliven Bundy's ranch in Nevada, a couple of his sons, Ammon and Ryan, decided to go up to Oregon to protest the resentencing of a couple of ranchers on some federal crimes charges. Long story short, those protests fell apart. Ammon, Ryan, and several of their friends decided they would travel to the Malheur Refuge about an hour away, and they would occupy the government buildings in that area as a hard stand against the federal government. And they were there for a little bit more than a month before the last of the occupiers were arrested. Interestingly, from the earliest days of that occupation, Oath Keepers began issuing statements, primarily in the form of new posts to their website, also a couple of YouTube videos, where they argued that the occupation was a mistake. And specifically what they said was, this occupation does not follow the model set for us by those who fought against the British in the 18th century. Those who fought against the British defended their homes. These people who have occupied the refuge, they have gone out to someone else's land and they have proactively occupied that land. The moral or legal or political justness of their cause isn't the point. The point is this is a strategic mistake and it's not going to win us support for our cause. So they actually urged Ammon and some of his supporters to cease the occupation early. But pretty soon they decided that they couldn't completely stand by and let this happen. So one of their chapters, Josephine County Oath Keepers from Oregon, decided to form an umbrella organization with some 3%ers groups called the Pacific Patriot Network. And they decided that they would be an armed buffer between law enforcement and the occupiers, specifically to prevent law enforcement from, quote unquote, Wacoing the occupiers.
This highlights another thing that struck me as I read your book, a consistent theme that Oath Keepers seem to stress in their activities is that of providing quote unquote security for people who may be in opposition to the government. And the operation in the vicinity of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, while it wasn't framed explicitly as security, was providing a buffer. And I was curious because it strikes me that this, on the one hand, uses some of the same strategic ambiguity you discussed in the natural rights side, because who can oppose the idea of security? And yet at the same time, cuts at the very notion of a state. I mean, we've already brought in Benedict Anderson. Let's bring in some Max Weber. If a state is that organization with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, then by definition, the use of violence by anyone other than the state is not legitimate. And so I'm curious about the role that guns play in this, as well as the apparent contradiction between dedication to the principles of a society and usurping the functions of that society.
Those are great questions. And I'm glad that I get to talk about guns while I think about the second one, because the second one's a little tricky. Guns are all over the place for Oath Keepers. And earlier I talked about the Patriot Militia Movement, which a lot of people refer to as the militia movement. I call it the Patriot Militia Movement because some of these organizations, like Oath Keepers, are not necessarily militias in the sense that they have like a paramilitary structure and paramilitary uniforms, even if they have some paramilitary operations. But really core to this is this idea, which might be familiar to some of your listeners from other contexts, that the Second Amendment is the right that protects all other rights. It is your last bastion of protection against tyranny and violation of your rights. Therefore, you need to be ready and willing to use your guns to defend your rights. And I think on the one hand, there's that sort of political approach to the Second Amendment, but there are also some cultural things going on here, which I don't think I really talk about in the book. Oath Keepers has a nationwide spread and a nationwide presence. They are in Orange County, California. They're in Long Island, New York. They're also in Montana and in rural Oregon and in Florida and in Texas. They're all over the place. But they definitely have this rural ethos of we are ranchers and farmers. We are contractors. We are builders. We're not white collar professionals. We're rugged outdoorsmen. We know how to take care of ourselves. We can provide for ourselves off the land. We have contingency plans for when shit hits the fan or for Teotwaki, the end of the world as we know it. We will be able to survive even if no one else can. And I think guns are really bound up in that, both as tools and as cultural symbols of who we are. We see this as well in some of the political activism that has happened over the past few years of people who engage in protests and demonstrations and are heavily armed when they do so. And I think some observers would point to that and say, why do you need a gun to express your First Amendment rights? That doesn't make any sense. But for these people, it's not that they need the gun in order to engage in that First Amendment activity. It's that it's part of the culture, it's part of the communication, and it's also their right to do so. So guns sort of play a number of different roles for Oath Keepers, from it's functional in allowing you to protect your rights. It's also a cultural symbol of who you are and what you care about and what your values are. And there's also just a perception that guns are cool and guns are fun, and going out in the woods and shooting is fun, and finding the right kind of configuration is good. And then because Oath Keepers tries to recruit current and former law enforcement, although it's not clear how successful they actually are at that, these are people who have been around guns and have been around body armor and tactical vests and all of this sort of tacti-cool gear, who are trying to sort of continue to engage with those set of cultural symbols and tools.
So yeah, now about the second part.
So I'm going to respond to your question a little bit differently. And hopefully this still gets at the heart of what you're asking, which is this idea of recruiting from law enforcement and military, and wanting law enforcement and military to be on your side, and encouraging these people to honor their oaths, while also being in conflict with these people and with carrying guns in anticipation of a conflict with these officers of state authority. This is a conflict for them, but it's actually one that they think about explicitly to some extent. And this is perhaps nowhere more acute than at the Bundy Ranch standoff. So at this moment, Cliven Bundy has invited armed Americans from around the country to come to his ranch in Nevada to help him defend his rights, according to his framing of that situation. And Oath Keepers were among those who responded. Many people from across the country came with their guns. They came ready to camp. They came ready to do whatever needed to be done to protect Cliven Bundy and his family. And we saw dramatic images of heavily armed people. That there's this famous image taken by a Reuters photographer, Jim Urquhart, of a guy named Eric Stewart, I think, who is crouched behind a concrete barrier, pointing an AR-style rifle down into a chasm towards federal law enforcement. How does this work? How is this contradiction resolved for Oath Keepers? Well, ultimately, they say that you're an oath keeper or you're an oath breaker. And we want all oath keepers to be on our side. All oath keepers are on our side by definition if they recognize the oath that they took to defend the Constitution, and if they're willing to honor that oath. Those members of law enforcement and the military who are not willing to honor that oath, they are oath breakers. They are traitors to the Constitution, and we will fight against them if necessary.
So that approach strikes me as one that undermines the notion of collectivity within a society, because the definition of keeping or breaking an oath is determined by the members of this group, and the members of this group seem to share characteristics and outlook and experience. One of the sets of characteristics, however, that you mention among some anti-government extremist groups, in fact, your topology of extremist groups on the right wing includes anti-government, white supremacist, and nativist. It would seem that questions of racial identity would play a role in the identification of who is we, who gets to decide who the people are who keep oaths versus breaking them. And yet, as you detail, the Oath Keepers have kind of a troubled relationship with questions of race. They officially seem to eschew racism. At the same time, they lend their resources to the support and protection of racist causes. I'm wondering if you talk a little bit about that relationship and how that plays into their definition of who is and isn't an Oath Keeper, and who is and isn't part of the community or the society they see.
I'm really glad you asked that question. This is one of the soapboxes that I get on every time I talk about right-wing extremism. I think for a lot of good reasons, there's a tendency to assume that far right is synonymous with white supremacist in the US. Racist right-wing extremism has received the most attention from scholars, from journalists, and from all sorts of different observers, and rightfully so. Racism is a pernicious threat present all across American history. But there are some people who are not motivated by racial identity, and lumping them in with ideological racists creates problems if we want to try to reduce the threats posed by those types of extremists. So Oath Keepers, they say that they are organized around a patriotic identity, a national identity. We are American patriots, period. They include in their bylaws that anyone who has ever been a member of a racist organization is not welcome in Oath Keepers, although it's not really clear if they actually police around that provision at all. Stuart Rhodes periodically gets asked this question by journalists, and he likes to say, I'm a quarter Mexican. How could I possibly be a white supremacist? And in many ways, I don't want to go too far in giving him credit, but I think that it's true that he's not ideologically racist. He's not identifying a racial identity that is threatened and organizing his group around that. Instead, he's organizing around a national identity that is threatened, which in some ways overlaps with racial identities and some ways doesn't. But one of the things that I argue is that it's better to understand the bigotry of the Oath Keepers as nativism rather than racism. And the reason for that is they are happy to welcome people from different racial or ethnic groups into the community of good Americans, so long as they do so in the right way. For example, as a shorthand, I would say that they are anti-immigrant sometimes. They would respond, we're not anti-immigrant, we're anti-illegal immigrant. We welcome people from other countries so long as they follow the rules in getting here. What we are opposed to is people not following the rules. I would describe them as an Islamophobic organization. There is some really virulent Islamophobia and bigotry against Muslims in some of the things that they post and share online. They would say, we're not anti-Muslim or anti-Islam, we're anti-radical Islam. As long as it's a Muslim who will accept the American way of life and does not hold on to those beliefs of Islam that are incompatible with America, we welcome them. And of course, your listeners can't see the exaggerated facial expressions that I'm making right now to show just how little credence I give to that argument that they make. But I do think that distinction is worth noting. And it really has important consequences when we think about, okay, if Oath Keepers is a threat, if we think that they might engage in violent and criminal behavior like an insurrection at the US Capitol, how do we try to mitigate that threat? If you approach them by saying, you're just a racist, and if you just accept that Black people are people too, everything will be okay, that's not going to have any positive effect at mitigating the threat of Oath Keepers.
You're bringing up questions of immigration and Islamophobia ties in then to the agenda of President Trump. He certainly campaigned on a platform of limiting immigration as well as of implementing a Muslim ban. Those tie neatly into the apparent congeniality of the platform of President Trump with what it is that the Oath Keepers have argued in favor of. And as you detail in the book, but your research really cuts off early in the Trump administration, around 2017, 2018, they found in President Trump someone who they believed represented the ideals that they represented and became quite supportive of him, even if there wasn't perfect overlap. And I don't mean to suggest that all Trump supporters are Oath Keepers, but it did seem there was a large number of Oath Keepers who were Trump supporters. Asking you to project a bit, as we move into a post-Trump era, how do you see this alignment, this affinity, this ideology affecting the organization going forward, affecting American political discourse?
I'm going to throw up so many caveats in answering this question. The first is I'm really bad at projecting. I try not to make predictions about what I think is likely to happen. Instead, I'll suggest some possibilities without assigning probabilities to them. One possibility that we could see is a return. Actually, let me take a step back and give you another caveat before I start answering your question. Sometimes I think it's important to pay attention to specific groups and actors like Oath Keepers. And other times I think it's more important to pay attention to the broader movement that they're part of. I wrote a book about Oath Keepers in large part because the organization demonstrates and embodies so many of the trends of the broader Patriot Militia movement and anti-government extremism of which it's a part. I think it's a mistake to focus too much on the Oath Keepers, though. Part of this is actually verbalized by the Oath Keepers themselves when Stuart Rhodes says things like, I don't care whether you join the group or not, as long as you're an Oath Keeper in lowercase, that's what I care about. So too much focus on individual groups is going to lose the more diffuse and broader movement of people who hold similar ideas but might not be part of the same formal organization. Okay, now let me try to actually answer your question. There are a few different possibilities that we could see. One possibility is that the Patriot Militia movement reverts to its form during the Obama years, where there's a centrality of concerns about gun control. There comes to be more and more rhetoric about tyranny. We see increasing depictions of martial law as something that is being contemplated by the highest corrupt powers in the government to be used against Americans. Very much a repeat of the themes of 2008 through 2016. And one of the reasons that's possible, of course, is because Joe Biden was the VP under Obama. And many people in his ranks of political appointees that have been announced so far are Obama veterans. I think another possibility, though, is that the sort of cult of Trump that has emerged over the past however many years continues even after Trump leaves office. And that different factions of anti-government extremism continue to organize around Trump rather than around some of these other political principles that are more the focus of my analysis. We could see Trump saying things like, I should be in the White House, or Joe Biden is not the legitimate president and nothing that he does has legal authority. And we could see people, particularly anti-government extremists, particularly those who engage with conspiracy theories, for example, QAnon, saying that Trump's declarations are the legitimate ones, are the ones with legal and political force. And we could see people rally around him in that way, and they could legitimize any sort of anti-government action that they take as that's not the real government, so I'm not really committing a crime against law enforcement because they're not real law enforcement. That's really speculative, though. And, there are innumerable other ways that anti-government extremism could go in the future. We could see them continue to respond to COVID-19 pandemics and attempts to mitigate some of the threats of the pandemics as tyranny. We could see them point to any increasing efforts to mitigate the threats of climate change as an example of tyranny, or the New World Order, or any number of other conspiracy theories that they've promoted over the past 30 years.
I think we have time for one last question before we go. And one of the things that struck me in reading your work is that while they focus on different issues, that there is a similarity in background and in experience in terms of having fought an inconclusive war between those who founded the Oath Keepers and people who Kathleen Belew identifies as initial leaders in the rejuvenated white supremacist movement in her excellent book, Bringing the War Home. And I'm curious your thoughts on the role of military experience and militarism in fueling various flavors of right-wing extremism.
This is a really interesting question. And it's one that I don't have a lot of strong insight to offer about. People who study extremism and terrorism note that first of all, there's no one profile that predicts who's going to become an extremist or a terrorist. And they also know that there are multiple pathways. And I think that one pathway is this sense of adventure and action and adrenaline that, for example, some journalists who have embedded with military write about this adrenaline rush that is being in combat and how difficult life is afterwards when everything else just seems so meaningless or doesn't provide that same emotional rush or whatever the case may be. And, that could well be what motivates some people to join a group like Oath Keepers or a movement like anti-government extremism. There's also, I think, a sense of community that's built in military and law enforcement experience. And we've seen some interviews with folks who have been involved in various militia organizations or militia-like organizations who have talked about leaving their military service and searching for that sense of family or community and finding it in these paramilitary organizations that operate outside the law. And some people have suggested that, maybe if we can find other ways to provide these people with community or options for community, we can keep them from being drawn into these extremist spaces. This question of sort of like a failed war leading people to engage in extremism, that's a really difficult one for me to grapple with, partially because so many people also have that experience of being a soldier in an unwon war who don't come back and join extremist groups, which doesn't necessarily undercut that argument so much as it emphasizes that there's no good predictor of who's going to join these groups and movements. And so much of it comes down to the convergence of multiple independent variables, if we would like to use that language, in order to produce this outcome. But some of it also seems to me to be that there are people who are in these movements who were never part of these struggles, but who also still identify struggles that they were part of. I think of Mike Vanderboe, who is the person who developed the idea of the 3 percenters, which is this movement that is very similar to Oath Keepers. Vanderboe died a few years ago, and he constantly talked about war. He wrote a novel about a civil war, an apocalyptic civil war in America, pitting American patriots against the government. He had this blog where he prolifically posted things about gun politics and gun strategy and political philosophy and all this other stuff. He was never a veteran. He never served in the military. And yet he very much had this identity of someone who was a warrior, a soldier in this big battle. I'm not quite sure yet what to think about this idea of how military service, especially in the context of unwon wars, contributes to extremism.
It's a challenging question, and the more so when you expand it to include societal militarism, because I think the degree to which we have exalted not only military service itself, but the trappings of military service, and at times separated the violence perpetrated by the military from the professional and ethical regulation that governs it, makes it a lot easier for people to latch onto that and to turn it to almost any political end they desire. So it's a fascinating but not very satisfying question as of yet. We've been talking with Dr. Sam Jackson, professor at the University of Albany, author of Oath Keepers: Patriotism and the Edge of Violence in a Right-Wing Anti-Government Group, published by Columbia University Press in September 2020. I would highly commend the book to our listeners. It's a really useful way to gain a better understanding, which helps you, I think, to better understand what alternatives might be available in dealing with some very disturbing and challenging political developments in our country. Sam, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a great conversation.
Thanks. This was great.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.